Good afternoon, everybody. Let's get this webinar underway. Thank you very much for joining. There's currently 17 people on the line, and I'm sure we'll have a few more people join as we go through the slides. So, as you probably know, the agenda for this afternoon is to talk about an overview of the Level 2 processes and some updates on recent changes. So this is definitely relevant for people who know NABERS program very well and have been following us for several years. Some things have changed. So this is especially for you, but also very important for new assessors. And the second half hour will be opening up for broader questions about the NABERS program to anybody, but in particular people that have just become assessors or soon to train with us. So a little bit of housekeeping before we go into the thick of it. So in terms of today's speakers, these are the people you're going to be hearing from. You've already been hearing from me. So my name is Astrid Nev. I manage the training program for NABERS. So what that means is I organise base courses. So most of you would have attended those courses at one point over the last few years. And I also help coordinate the online training program. So you may have seen, but we have quite a few new online courses that have been launched over the last 6 to 9 months. So I work quite closely with my colleague Charlotte on launching those. You'll also be hearing from Carlos Tofa. He's the auditing program manager and has been running this part of the program for many years. So he's definitely a seasoned veteran of the NABERS program. And you'll also be hearing from my colleague Robert Hughes. Rob is part of the apartment buildings team. So the apartment buildings tool was launched last year and he was a key player in that. He's also been very much involved with the Level 2 program over the last few months while Carlos was on leave, so a great person to hear from on that. And he's currently also working on auditing doing level 1 audits, and he's working on the carbon neutral program as well. So quite a wide variety of skills today. I'll be passing over to Carlos Tofa, who will take you through the first part of the presentation.
Thank you, Astrid, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome to this presentation. I think I want to stress out how important this is, and every single NABERS assessor that is regularly doing ratings is sooner or later going to be selected for audits as part of our random selection process. So I'm really happy that we have so many people joining us today to learn about this important component of what we do. As Astrid mentioned a moment ago, I've been running this program for around 4.5 years now. And we have seen a lot of very good things as a result of it that hopefully you'll learn about today. As Astrid also mentioned, I was on leave for a few months in the second half of last year, and that's when my colleague Rob was acting on my position. So the way we want to structure today's presentation is I'm going to talk about the overarching general rationale behind compliance and quality assurance and how we do the Level 2 audits and the rationale behind that. And then I'll hand over to Rob, who's going to talk about the new procedure, some fundamental changes in difference with the previous one, because I can see that there's a lot of our old assessors joining us today as well. So hopefully you will find this interesting and relevant to what you do. So with that in mind, let's just jump immediately to whatever I'm going to be talking to you about. So I want to guide you through a few comments about compliance and quality assurance in NABERS. There's a little bit of information there about what's the legal framework that justifies us doing audits. I also want to mention what the principles and goals behind the auditing program are. And also, it's going to be important to talk about who the parties involved in the auditing process are and what are the responsibilities, generally speaking. And that's when we'll hand over to Rob, who's going to talk about the details of the actual process. So in terms of compliance and quality assurance, as you would appreciate, this is a central and critical component of the integrity and credibility of the NABERS program in the eyes of our multiple stakeholders. As you would all appreciate, NABERS is a unique performance certification scheme in the world, and robustness and transparency and accountability of the program is critical in the eyes of all our stakeholders. And the role of auditing in that compliance and quality assurance perspective is critical. One of the things that we intend to do with auditing is to identify the gaps in assessors' knowledge as well. I mean, ultimately, assessors are the face of the program out there in the industry while they perform the ratings. And it is important to ensure that their knowledge and the way they apply, interpret, and use the rules is in accordance, with the values and principles of the program in the sake of, equality and transparency. We also use the auditing program as a tool to improve our NABERS rules, processes, and procedures in an ongoing basis. It is the way we close the continuous improvement loop. And but it's very important as well that when we talk about our ratings, we apply a fair, correct, and consistent application of the NABERS rules to all certified ratings. It is very important as well to mention that the NABERS values that underpin the program are mostly integrity, quality, public service, leadership, and collaboration. This is critical to understand, and it is interesting to know that in the recent efforts that we undertook to consult about our NABERS strategic plan, that particular component and all the values underpinning auditing and the robustness of the program were paramount and were critical to everyone else. So we can just move to the next. Yep, all right. So in terms of quality assurance, we have two types of audits that we do within NABERS. The experienced assessors will know this already, but for the new ones, we have the level 1 audits that are performing 100% of the ratings that we certify. These are conducted internally by our team of technical officers, and essentially constitutes the first step in quality assurance. The level 2 audits are performed on 5% of our ratings, and they are done by external auditors of the program. These auditors are selected by tender every 2 years, and essentially undertaking an audit is a peer review process that essentially delivers a complete recreation and re-rating of the premises. Now, briefly, I wanted to mention the legal framework and the commercial building disclosure implications here. There are two, you would be familiar with the CBD program that has essentially 2 objectives. One is to improve energy efficiency of large office buildings, and the other one is to inform prospective buyers and tenants. We are not the CBD administrator, but we work in close collaboration with them. And it is important to know that NABERS ratings are used to comply with CBD and federal legislation requirements. So the legal framework is essentially OEH, as the administrator of the NABERS program, has been an appointed auditing authority under the Building Energy Efficient and Disclosure Act, the BEAD Act. And as a result, and the commitment we have with our federal partners, the CPD program, is that we are committed to certify 5% of the ratings completed to obtain a BEAD, which is the Building Energy Efficient Certificate. Now, in terms of the principles underpinning the auditing program, I mean, the national administrator, us NABERS, strive to allocate audits in a fair and consistent manner, and all audits are allocated in a random manner, except when we identify some clear risk. We obviously intend to maintain the integrity of the program, as I said, as well as CBD. It is important as well to understand auditing not as a punitive and a punishment tool, but it's also to support the improvement of the NABERS assessors as well as the skills and knowledge. We obviously want to ensure this transparent peer review process, and the accuracy of star ratings is very important. In some cases, we actually have to revise or withdraw ratings as a result of a level 2 audit, which has very severe implications, as you would assume. And obviously, it's important for us to know that accredited assessors are performing with integrity and diligence as part of the whole process, and that the fair and consistent outcomes are assured as part of the process. Now, very briefly, I have three slides left in my presentation here. The 3 parties involved in the auditing process are essentially us, NABERS, the auditors and the assessors. So the process management is essentially what we do as part of NABERS. We don't get necessarily that involved in the level 2 audit process, but we're there to manage the process and actually jump in and mediate when there's any need. We appoint the auditors based on a very competitive tender, and we strive to ensure that the people and the professionals that we involve are actually very qualified to actually undertake the role. As part of that appointment process, we want to give as much opportunities to other assessors as it is feasible, but there's a very stringent amount of criteria that they actually have to comply with. It is important to say that we are monitoring performance of auditors as well as the accredited assessors. It is important that auditors comply with our timeframes, with their responsibilities, and with the code of practice as well. And in cases where we identify breaches with their performance, we actually also apply sanctions to them, or we can essentially terminate the contracts if there's any need. When there's any need, we revise NABERS ratings, so we change or withdraw them altogether, depending on the case. And we don't like doing this, but as per our procedure, sometimes it is necessary to actually issue sanctions to assessors that vary in severity depending on the issues identified as part of the audits. And obviously, we communicate the results of audits to all the relevant parties. Now, NABERS auditors are obliged to undertake audits as they're required by us. They must adhere to the program's timeframes and requirements, and it's very important to say that the confidentiality requirements that we have are very severe and very strict, and information cannot be disclosed because they receive all the information that was used for ratings. And obviously, they also have to apply and do their job in accordance with the NABERS code of practice and the contractual obligations as well. So finally, what are the responsibilities for you guys? Essentially, as NABERS accredited assessors, you are required to complete ratings in a compliant and diligent manner. You are required also contractually and according to the code of practice to fully cooperate with the national administrator and the auditor as part of the process. You are required to fully document writings. The experienced assessors that are in the audience now that have been audited would agree that it is very important to have a rating that is completely and thoroughly documented. And of course, as we all do, we have to adhere to the code of practice, and obviously we have to abide by any decision and penalty that we may apply as a result of an audit. So in a nutshell, that is what underpins the overarching concept behind auditing. And now I want to hand over to my colleague, Rob, that is going to talk to you about the process. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carlos. Yes, so I will be talking about the level 2 process in a little more specific detail. Here you can see, I guess, a general overview of the major steps in the process, starting with the selection of a particular rating to be audited, followed by the audit itself. I will go into more depth on all of these. Once the audit is conducted, the auditor will report the findings to NABERS, and then there'll be a review of those findings. If there's no issues or only minor issues identified, then we can proceed to finalise the outcomes of that audit. However, if there are moderate or major issues, then there'll be a right of reply offered to the assessor to basically explain what's going on or clarify some issues, in which case then we'll, once that's resolved, we'll also move to the outcome stage. So in terms of the assessor's role, there's sort of 4 main areas where assessors are involved, and I guess the first and perhaps the most important one is to be prepared for an audit straight off the bat. I'll go into more depth on each of these as well. And so we usually kick off the audit by the assessor supplying the required information to the auditor. And should it come to major or moderate issues being identified, they'll be given a right of reply. So then assessors can respond to those issues picked up by the auditor. Following that outcome, of course, the whole intention of the process is to identify areas for improvement, and so it's important for the assessor to reflect and potentially act on some of those outcomes as well. As I mentioned, being prepared for the audit is the first and quite important step in an audit process. So even prior to being selected, collecting and organising and storing all of the required evidence and in the appropriate formats is quite important, and will help you a lot through the audit as well. If you're in doubt about the approach you take through a rating, then certainly contact NABERS in advance. It's much easier for assessors, should I say, to address any tricky issues before getting to the audit stage. And if you've been given some advice, then keep copies of that so that can be used through any subsequent audit as well. And yeah, certainly advising of any delays and responding promptly to these requests is also being prepared to respond quickly is helpful to get through an audit. So as Carlos mentioned, around 5% of all ratings are randomly selected. However, some can also be selected for specific reasons, such as an assessor was previously sanctioned, which required further level 2 audits, or perhaps other things were picked up at the level one audit stage, or potentially other reasons have identified a particular rating for a level 2 audit. Now, once the rating has been selected, then assessors will receive an email notification, and that will basically advise how and when to respond. So supplying information is the second and quite important stage. Obviously, you're required to keep evidence for 7 years, so we don't tend to go back that far. It's usually much more recent than that, but yeah, just flagging that's a requirement. So, and this is one of the changes in the recent updates to the policy and procedures that some may be familiar with, and this is basically to emphasise that the information supplied should be through a standard format, which is basically in line with that laid out in the rules for each rating type. This is an example for an office rating, basically a structured folder template is provided, and yeah, we're requesting that documents are put into the appropriate areas to support your rating. So another change in the policy is, well, I guess an emphasis on the upfront provision of information. So we're requesting it just, well, after the first request, where we're expecting that most, or if not all, of the evidence is provided, there may be another follow-up request, and that's more around clarifications. But following that, we don't want to see sort of back and forwards of requests for more information. So after that, the audit can be conducted and reported. So it's really in your best interest to get information supplied within the first 10 days and potentially another 5 days if there are requests from the auditor. So information provided after that deadline will be used primarily to confirm the star rating accuracy. That's if there's still uncertainty around what the star rating is or should be, there might be more information required. But if it hasn't been provided by that stage, then it's assumed that it wasn't used by the assessor, and then that will count against you in the audit. So this is a very small minority of cases, but where assessors are unwilling or reluctant to provide data, then there are new measures in the policy and procedure to allow us to, I guess, encourage them to provide that, such as suspension of their accreditation. So during the audit itself, the auditor will recreate the rating based on all the evidence that you've provided. So it's really up to the assessor to support their findings with their evidence that you have, that you collected prior to the rating, because that's what the auditor will use to recreate the rating, and you're wanting them to come up with the, I guess, identical result. So the auditor will consider and report to NABERS basically their assessment of the performance, such as how an assessor has applied the rules and what the standard of evidence is, and how this relates to the accuracy and the certainty of that rating. So basically to be able to confirm or otherwise that the rating is correct. So some things that can occur during the audit, and particularly through the provision of evidence and information to the auditor. If you provided information but it's disorganised or it's not following the instructions, then the auditor can potentially reject that or perhaps request that you reorganise that and submit it in the right format. And that's basically to help the auditor to know how you've treated each piece of evidence, and that you've to make it a lot easier for the auditor to understand what's been done and how the rating has been calculated. And if you can't get it in by the deadline, then it can be treated as not being provided. If it does come after the deadline, it'll be used to evaluate the impact on the rating result, so it could still be considered as valid for determining the star rating, but again can count against the performance and lead to potential sanctions. And as I mentioned, if no information is provided, then there's new procedures in place such as suspension of accreditation. So the timeframes in the new policy and procedure document, we've updated some of the timeframes, not so much for assessors, which is much as it was, although we're emphasising definitely providing the documents at the first opportunity. But now for NABERS, our goal is to review or finalise 80% of audits within 10 days of us receiving them. Be potentially longer if a panel needs to be called. And the auditors now have a 4-week window to report the audit. There's also 10 days for both parties, auditors and assessors, to respond to each stage of a right of reply. So as mentioned earlier, organising and preparing the documents, documenting this well, should allow you to be able to provide documents for an audit relatively easily. I guess it shouldn't be the case that assessors are trying to chase up evidence that should have been prepared prior to lodgement of the rating. So we're really trying to emphasise that sort of front-end preparation to then be able to, when a rating is selected for audit, provide those documents as soon as possible. How, I guess, slow responses beyond the deadline would be considered as part of the audit determination and outcomes. And yeah, I mentioned possible suspension until information is provided. So I mentioned the right of reply stage. This is where there's moderate or major issues identified by the auditors, or there are star rating changes. So in this case, and again, this is another point we've slightly changed in the most recent policy. The assessor responds now directly to the auditor and vice versa. So they'll basically, the auditor will identify issues and the assessor will respond and perhaps try to explain their case and how they've applied the rules and so on. So NABERS can intervene. We'll be copied into these, and we can intervene if we request it or if we see the need, either to provide guidance on how the rules are being treated or otherwise to moderate the conversation. So it's important that, as it is direct conversation, that the conduct is professional and respectful in that regards. So following the right of reply, once both parties have their cases heard, NABERS would consider the findings of the auditors and any of the points raised through the right of reply, as well as the general, I guess, promptness and conduct of assessors. Through this, we're basically trying to resolve how the rating was conducted, how accurate it was, what the level of understanding of the rules the assessors have, if there are any, I guess, shortcomings in any of those areas. So following that, we'll determine what outcomes would be appropriate to, I guess, remedy this current rating or improve performance going forward. And indeed, the determinations can also guide the development and improvements of our own rules and as well as internal processes. So once outcomes have been determined, assessors will be advised of what those are. There'll be feedback on any issues found and perhaps some recommendations, and if required, then there's also sanctions that could be applied. If the star rating has changed as a result, then certificates will be reissued, and we're obliged to then at that point advise customers and the CBD program if that's relevant for that particular rating. And additionally, if there is an issue around the premises itself, then we may place conditions or notes around that premises to apply for future ratings and audits. So just to touch on sanctions, which can be some of the outcomes from an audit. So as Carlos mentioned, one of the goals is really to improve future performance and rating accuracy. It's not like punitive for the sake of it, but to drive some of those. They can include, for example, further level 2 audits on subsequent ratings. So you might have another one of your ratings picked up in the next 6 or 12 months, for example. Potentially, if it's called for, then retraining could be prescribed, and there could also be a requirement for supervised ratings, for your next rating to be supervised, for example. If this is a repeat fault or a level 2 audit that was a sanction from another one has picked up further issues, then sanctions might be slightly more severe as well. And it's also good to point out that these outcomes and sanctions can be also shared within NABERS for the level 1 auditors within the technical team, as well as with our partners at the CBD program. So just to sum up, a couple of main points is that good preparation and organisation up front will help make the process go much smoother for you and for the auditors. And also it's good to keep in mind that the onus is really on the assessor to be able to justify how they've conducted their ratings. But it's also valuable to see that level 2 audits can be a good learning opportunity. So, use the guidance of the auditors who are really experts in the field, and it's a good opportunity to understand and learn from their guidance. But as always, if you're ever uncertain about anything during a rating or audit, then please get in contact with us at NABERS. A couple of questions coming in on the chat. So if there is claims by auditors that are incorrect, or if auditors themselves are wrong in what they are saying, what happens with that? Does that ever happen? That is certainly a possibility, and I guess it's important to note the final say doesn't rest with the auditors. We have the final say, the determination sits with NABERS, and certainly contentious issues, we have a process to go through to determine what is the best outcome, and we certainly don't take anything straight on face value from what the auditor says necessarily without considering the alternatives. So yeah, we do have a process for considering issues like that. There was another question. Carlos, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, look, thanks for that, Rob. No, look, what you answer is correct, and this is something unusual. It actually happens frequently. You know, auditors are also humans, and they made mistakes. As we all know, there are certain areas of the rules that are grey, or they're not necessarily that clear, which is something we work on constantly to try to improve. But look, the role of an auditor is essentially try to apply the rules as per the letter, and that is essentially what most of them effectively do. But in saying so, they may not be aware of certain allowances that are provided often by level, technical officers and the technical team in terms of alternative ways of applying and interpreting the rules. However, even if that is not the case, when there's confusions, sometimes they actually have wrong assumptions, right? But as Rob was clearly saying, and this is important to know, the level 2 audit program and process is actually quite strict, but there is a lot of flexibility as well in the spirit of fairness. What we intend, especially when the mistakes by the auditor are critical, it is something that we normally deal with as part of the right of reply stage, where we have a little bit of back and forth, where the national administrator, us, NABERS, plays an important role to try to mediate these things. And by all means, we have to make sure in all cases that every party is actually well informed and satisfied that the final outcome of an audit has been properly discussed and peer reviewed. But definitely, auditors make errors as well. And if you don't mind, Rob, if you want to comment a little bit after that as well, I'll just jump into the next question that we received. That has to do with, it says, question regarding all paper versus electronic format single line diagrams. And it says that paper often is illegible when photographed, but can be read under bright light. Look, that is a good point, right? But in this particular case, single line diagrams are critical pieces of documentation to validate the coverage of energy or water if it is a reticulation diagram for that purpose for audit. And auditors are in the need to receive clear documentation that allows them to actually verify that and to match the information in a single line diagram with whatever additional information is being provided to them in terms of identification of meters, photographs, and the like. If there is a particular case where there's an issue because a single line diagram cannot be read, then we look for alternatives to actually make that legible as part of the flexibility that I was mentioning before. But it is certainly a good question, and it is important that all documentation provided for audit is as clear as possible, and that's what we try to do in all instances. Yep. Did you want to comment something else on that, Rob?
Not on that one per se. Shall I move on to another question?
Sure.
Yeah, great. So another one, just regarding, what happens when assessors are on leave, are out of office replies accepted as, how is that treated under the timeframes? And I think the short answer is probably that yes, out of offices are accepted, or, assessors going on leave is accounted for. Certainly, we deal with a number of extensions. It's not unusual. So, but certainly it's important for us to be aware of that being the case as soon as possible. Would you agree, Carlos?
Yeah, totally. And this is an important one. We have very tight and, in some cases, severe timeframes, if you wish. But the most important thing is communication, and we encourage that open communication with us at any point during the audit process. When problems start occurring is when there is no communication, and then we're just essentially waiting for information that was due 2 weeks ago, and we have no idea what's going on there. But the flexibility that we have is always assessed within reason, and obviously periods of leave or holiday or illness or whatever other reason are always considered. And when there's a very good reason, which is reasonable and it's been discussed prior to the deadline, I can confidently say that in 100% of the cases where we deal with those things, we're actually granting extensions that are reasonable as well. That is not always the case. Also, it can be that the assessor is here, there's no leave or no issues like that, but sometimes they're struggling getting additional information or responses from the customer for rating, for example. And so that's a little bit different. But also we treat every single request for an extension on a case-by-case basis, and within reason we always allow for those extensions as well. But the important thing here and the message is to keep the communication open early in the process. And we have a few more minutes before we wrap this up. I thought I'd thank everyone for joining us as well. Just wanted to mention this whole compliance and quality assurance and level 2 audit program can be quite daunting and stressful. And if you wish the presentation we just gave you, it sounds a little bit even harsh and a little bit pretty strict, etc. There is a truth behind that, but for those assessors that are already experienced and have gone through the auditing program a number of times, they would have realized that as the program has evolved and as assessors get more experience and get more used to being audited and understand the implications and the process in itself, this doesn't need to be anything like that. When ratings are very well documented from the onset, where all documentation is there, all assumptions, all evidence to actually validate their doings as per the provisions of the rules, the result of an audit is very simple. I mean, audits can actually be completed in 2-3 weeks maximum without any major or significant issues identified, and then we just simply move on, guaranteeing the compliance and integrity of the program. Obviously, we have opinions on both sides of the aisle, and those assessors that unfortunately didn't do that well in an audit may have a different opinion of the whole process. But the truth is that we're a bunch of reasonable people here, and we try to enforce the auditing program in a reasonable manner, and that has a very critical value that has been underpinning the success of it in the past few years. So my recommendation to you is don't necessarily be scared or stressed about it, and you will notice that we're always open for consultation and discussion, and we, as I was saying before, exercise flexibility within reason as needed. But you will see that if your ratings are well documented from the onset, you will have no problem whatsoever as part of the process. Rob and I had to rush a little bit because we could be talking about this for hours, so apologies for that, but I really hope that the information today was really useful for you. And if there's any more additional questions that may arise in the next few days, feel free to contact us directly via the general email of NABERS or directly to us. And I just wanted to thank you again, and we're here to assist. Thank you.